There's a particular kind of cruelty in the idea of a plane crash saving someone's life. Not because the crash itself is survivable, though it is, for the people this show follows, but because of what a deserted island quietly takes away from a person who was drowning long before the plane ever went down. No dealer, no hiding spot nobody knows about. No convenient excuse to slip away from the group for 20 minutes. Just you, and the thing you've been running from, and nowhere left to run to. That's the story underneath Charlie Pace's entire first season on Lost, and it's one of the more honest, unglamorous portraits of addiction American television had put on screen in years. This isn't a video about rock bottom as a dramatic device. It's about what the show does with a man who hits it in the one place on Earth he can't buy his way out of it. Spoiler free for anything past season 1, as always. Let's get into it. Start with who Charlie is when the plane goes down, because the show is careful to give you the image before it gives you the truth. He's introduced as a musician, the bassist for a band called Driveshaft, minor one-hit wonders whose glory days are clearly behind them, though Charlie hasn't quite accepted that yet. He's got the leftover mannerisms of minor fame, a little vain, a little desperate to be recognized, quick with a joke, the kind of guy who name drops his own song within minutes of meeting someone. On a beach full of people processing genuine trauma, Charlie initially reads as almost comic relief, the washed-up rock star, out of his depth, more concerned with his ruined boots than the fact that he nearly died. It's a performance, and the show lets you sit in that performance just long enough to make the truth underneath it land harder when it finally surfaces. Because Charlie didn't get on that plane as a casual passenger enjoying a return from a modest music tour. He got on it in the middle of a heroin addiction that had already cost him almost everything that mattered to him, his band, on the edge of falling apart around him, his family at a painful distance, his own sense of who he was outside of the identity a fading hit song had built for him years earlier. And when Oceanic 815 goes down, Charlie isn't just a survivor of a plane crash. He's a man in active addiction, cut off without warning from his supply, stranded on an island with absolutely no way to get more. The show doesn't announce this. It reveals it the way it reveals almost everything in season 1, sideways, through a flashback, through small physical tells you might not clock on a first watch, a restlessness in his hands, a specific kind of desperation in his eyes during ordinary conversations, an urgency about a particular piece of the wreckage that seems disproportionate to anything he's saying out loud, and then it shows you what he's actually looking for, and the reveal recontextualizes every scene that came before it. Charlie has hidden a stash of heroin inside a set of small Virgin Mary statues, salvaged from the crash, and he spends the early episodes quietly, carefully making sure nobody finds them, not out of shame exactly, though there's shame in it too, but out of the specific animal urgency of someone who knows that stash is the only thing standing between him and a withdrawal he is not prepared to face on a deserted island with no doctor, no medication, and no privacy. I want to be careful and specific about what the show does well here, because it would have been easy to get this wrong. A lesser show turns addiction into either a punchline or a redemption arc with training wheels. A character who's a little troubled, conveniently gets clean off screen, and emerges lighter and wiser a few episodes later because the plot needed him healthy again. Lost doesn't take that shortcut. It shows you Charlie using, on the island in front of you, without cutting away to spare you the discomfort of it. It shows you the physical toll starting to build, the shakiness, the irritability, the way his charm starts fraying at the edges the more his supply dwindles. And crucially, it shows you that Charlie knows exactly what he's doing is a problem. This isn't a character who thinks he has it under control. He's hiding the statues specifically because some part of him understands that if the group found out, they'd be right to react the way people react to finding out someone's using. The show gives him self-awareness without giving him the will to act on it yet, and that gap, knowing and still doing it anyway, is a far more honest depiction of active addiction than most television bothers to attempt. And there's a reason it matters that the island strips away every one of his usual defenses. Back in his old life, Charlie had systems, ways of hiding it. People who either didn't know or chose not to look too closely. Money, or at least the memory of money, to keep the supply coming. A version of himself he could perform in public that let the private version stay private. None of that exists here. He is watched constantly by people with nothing else to do but notice each other. There's no dealer to call, and once what he's carrying runs out, there is categorically no more, ever, no matter what he's willing to do or pay to get it. The island doesn't just interrupt Charlie's addiction, It ends his ability to manage it the way he's always managed it, which is a very different and much more frightening thing. Locke is the one who forces the issue, and it's worth pausing on how the show handles this confrontation, because it says a lot about both characters. Locke doesn't come at Charlie with judgment, exactly, though there's an edge of something almost predatory in how observant he is. He clocks what's going on with Charlie far earlier than anyone else does, quietly, the same watchfulness he brings to everything on this island. And when he finally confronts Charlie directly about the drugs, it isn't a lecture. It's closer to an ultimatum wrapped in something that almost resembles compassion. Locke destroys Charlie's remaining supply, not gradually, not with a conversation about treatment options that don't exist here anyway, but by throwing the statues into the ocean all at once, forcing the withdrawal to start whether Charlie is ready for it or not. It's a brutal scene, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. There's no clean, empowering, rock-bottom music cue. Charlie is furious and scared, and the fury and the fear are both completely legitimate reactions to what's just happened to him, because whatever else is true about the drugs, ripping them away without warning, without any medical support, on a beach with no doctor who specializes in this, is a genuinely dangerous thing to do to a person's body. Locke isn't a professional making a considered intervention. He's a man who has decided, on his own authority, that this is what needs to happen, and the show lets you sit with the discomfort of not being entirely sure he's right to make that call for someone else, even as it's also clear Charlie can't keep going the way he was going. What follows is some of the hardest material Season 1 puts on screen, and it's worth being honest that the show doesn't sanitize it. Charlie goes through withdrawal in front of the camp, sweating, shaking, sick, humiliated by how visible all of it is on a beach with nowhere private to fall apart. There's no montage that skips past the worst of it. The show sits with him in it uncomfortably for long enough that you feel the weight of what his body is actually going through. Not because it wants to be shocking, but because skipping past it would be its own kind of lie, the same lie Charlie's been telling himself and everyone around him for years. That this is manageable, that it's not that bad, that he's got it handled. The island won't let him tell that lie anymore, and neither will the show. And underneath the physical withdrawal, there's a psychological wound that the show takes just as seriously, because addiction, in Charlie's case, was never really about the drug itself. It's about what the drug was covering up. His flashbacks fill in a portrait of a man who has spent years chasing the version of himself that briefly existed when Driveshaft had a hit song, a version of Charlie who mattered, who was wanted, who didn't have to work quite so hard to be noticed. That fame faded fast, the way one-hit wonder fame usually does, and Charlie never really figured out who he was supposed to be once it was gone. The drugs filled that hole efficiently enough that he never had to find out. Strip the drugs away, and what's left standing on that beach isn't just an addict in withdrawal. It's a man forced, for maybe the first time in years, to actually sit with the emptiness the drugs were papering over. No fame here to hide inside, no old bandmates to perform charm for, nothing left to be except whoever he actually is when nobody's buying the act. Which is what makes Claire's role in his story so important and worth dwelling on, because it's easy to describe their relationship as just the sweet subplot of the season if you're not paying close attention to what it's actually doing. Claire, heavily pregnant and one of the most vulnerable people in the whole camp, is someone Charlie starts to genuinely care for, not performatively, not to seem like a good guy in front of the group, but in a way that seems to catch him a little off guard himself. And here's the important part. For the first time in a long while, Charlie has a reason to want to be reliable that has nothing to do with being noticed. Claire needs actual help, practical, unglamorous help, someone to sit with her, watch out for her, be steady when she's frightened. It's the opposite of the kind of attention Charlie spent years chasing through music and fame. Nobody's applauding him for it, and it turns out to be the thing that starts giving him a reason to stay clean that the withdrawal alone never could. That's a genuinely important distinction the show is drawing, whether or not it says so explicitly. Getting clean and staying clean are not the same fight. Locke throwing the statues into the ocean forces the first one. It does nothing on its own to solve the second. What actually starts to hold Charlie together as the season goes on isn't willpower summoned from nowhere, it's having something to be needed for that isn't built on performance. Being useful to Claire, being trusted with something real, gives Charlie access to a version of feeling valued that doesn't come with a calm down. It's not a cure. Season 1 never pretends it's a cure. but it's the first genuine alternative the show gives him to the thing he'd been running on for years, and it matters enormously that the alternative is connection, not just abstinence. There's a particular moment worth calling out without spoiling exactly where it falls in the timeline. Later in the season, in the middle of a crisis that has nothing directly to do with his addiction, Charlie is handed an opportunity to use again, genuinely handed it, not stolen or scrounged, just placed in front of him at a moment of real stress, the kind of moment his old life would have treated as an obvious excuse. And the show lets that scene breathe with real tension because it refuses to promise you which way he's going to go. That uncertainty is the whole point. Recovery, especially early recovery, especially recovery forced by circumstance rather than chosen freely, isn't a switch that flips once and stays flipped. It's a decision that has to keep getting made over and over, often at the exact moments it's hardest to make it. Lost understands that, and to its credit, it doesn't let Charlie's story become a straight line from rock bottom to redemption. It keeps the temptation real, keeps the stakes real, and lets him have to choose more than once whether the version of himself he's becoming is one worth protecting. I think what makes Charlie's Season 1 arc land as hard as it does in the end is that the island never gives him an easy villain to blame. There's no dealer character forcing pills on him, no single traumatic betrayal the show can point to as the reason. What it gives you instead is a man who was quietly, slowly disappearing into a habit long before any of this happened, on a plane on his way home from a tour nobody much cared about anymore, carrying a stash he'd hidden well enough that even people who loved him hadn't fully clocked how bad it had gotten. The crash didn't create Charlie's rock bottom, it just removed every tool he'd built to avoid looking directly at it. And the tragic, oddly hopeful irony sitting underneath the whole season is that surviving a plane crash, losing his career, his privacy, his supply, his ability to hide, might be the first genuinely honest position Charlie Pace has occupied in years. There's also something worth noticing in how the camp itself treats him once the truth is out, because the show is quietly making an argument about community here too, not just about willpower. Nobody organizes an intervention. Nobody sits him down for a formal, structured conversation about his choices, because there's no framework for that on a beach where everyone is simply trying to survive the day. But in the unstructured, almost accidental way people end up looking out for each other when they're forced into close quarters, Charlie stops being quite as alone with it as he was on the plane. Someone notices when he's struggling and doesn't say anything cruel about it. Someone gives him a task to do instead of a lecture to sit through. It's not treatment, it's not even necessarily intentional support, but it's a far cry from the isolation he was managing his addiction inside of before the crash. And the show seems to understand, even without stating it outright, that isolation is often as much the disease as the substance is. That's not the show saying addiction needs a catastrophe to be solved, and it's worth being clear about that, because that would be a dangerous and untrue thing for any story to imply. Not everyone gets stranded on an island that physically removes the substance from reach. Most people fighting this fight don't get that kind of forced, involuntary reset, and it would be a serious mistake to walk away from Charlie's story thinking rock bottom is a plan. What the show is actually showing you is smaller and more honest than that recovery, when it does happen, tends to need a few things lining up at once. The substance actually being out of reach, something real to hold on to once it is, and just as importantly, not having to hold on to it entirely alone. Charlie gets all three, more by accident than by choice, and the show is careful to make clear that having all three is what makes the difference, not suffering alone in silence the way he'd been doing for years before any of this happened. By the end of Season 1, Charlie is not fixed. I want to be honest about that rather than tie a bow on it, because the show itself refuses to. He's clean for now under the specific and extreme pressure of having no other option, and he's found something worth staying clean for in Claire and in the unborn child he's grown protective of. But the show is careful not to promise you that the fight is over, because addiction doesn't work that way, and a story that pretended otherwise would be lying to anyone watching who actually knows what this fight looks like from the inside. What Season 1 gives you instead is a beginning, fragile, hard-won, and entirely believable, and it trusts you to understand that a beginning is not the same as a happy ending. It's just, for a man who spent years running from himself, the first real chance to stop. If any part of this hit close to home, whether it's Charlie's story specifically, or something in your own life it happened to land on, You're not alone in that, and if you or someone you care about is struggling with addiction, reaching out to a real support line or a professional is worth doing. I'm not going to list resources here unless people want them, but they're not hard to find, and asking is never the weak move. If you want more of this channel's character work, Jack, Kate, Locke, Sawyer, and the story behind Boone and Shannon are all up already, alongside a look at the numbers and the flashback structure that ties every one of these arcs together. Subscribing genuinely helps a small channel like this one keep going. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the island.